Okay, welcome everyone to a new episode of the Jeff Nippard podcast. This is the fourth installment of the How Hard Should You Train mini-series, and in this one I'm speaking with Dr. Eric Helms. I think this was a really good discussion. It's one of the few conversations that I've had recently that felt right at the boundary of what we currently know about training, and we discussed some new concepts that I think many of you probably haven't thought about before. So we start out the podcast with some overarching framework for what it really means to train hard definitionally, and then we move on to questions like what the minimum RPE might be for maximizing muscle growth, whether or not there are any potential issues with your average gym goer relying on RPE, whether or not volume or intensity is the most fundamental variable, and we discuss what the science has to say about if there's any difference between taking sets to, say, an RPE of 8 versus an RPE of 10, and also the difference between session RPE and set RPE, so how hard each workout was versus how hard each set is. Now, just in case you're a bit rusty on the terminology, RPE stands for rating of perceived exertion, and as we discuss it here, it really just ranks how hard your set was on a scale of 1 to 10. So an RP of 10 would mean you reached failure with good form. An RP of 9 means you could have done one more rep, but you left 1 rep in the tank. RP 8 would mean you left 2 reps in the tank. RP 7 would mean you left 3 reps in the tank, and so on. And as always, I'll have timestamps in the description box down below in case you guys want to hop around according to topic, but I really do think that listening to the whole thing will really get you thinking critically about your training and help you put some of these concepts to use. And after this, I've got one more episode to go, so the final episode of the mini-series will be with Greg Nuckols, which was also great, so you guys can stay tuned for that. And without further ado, I give you guys my full conversation about how hard we should train with Dr. Eric Helms. Okay, so Eric, how hard should we train in the gym?
As hard as you need to make progress.
Nice.
So this is an interesting question. So the basic way that we express fitness is always typically it's at maximum intensity within a given volume restriction. So if you're a runner, how fast can I run a mile or 400 meters or a marathon, right? If you're a strength athlete, if you're at home and you love 5x5, what's my 5 rep max? The hardest that it can be for 5 reps. Or if I'm a power lifter, it's my 1 rep max on the big 3, Olympic lifter, snatch and clean and jerk. So for performance, when you are training to improve, kind of like the general basic physiological principle is that if you do that same thing and it's hard, you'll probably adapt because you're disrupting homeostasis. You don't have to train at a 5RM to improve your 5RM, but if you're training at like 5x5 80% or 3x5 or something, you can make some progress. And you add volume basically maybe when you need to. It's kind of a general principle. Like if you're a personal trainer, you first get people in, you don't have to do much. Hypertrophy is a little more complicated because the difficulty, you can change it while still getting a similar stimulus. You could do 8 sets of 5 if you wanted to failure, or you could do 4 sets of 15 2 reps shy of failure. The latter will probably feel easier. It'll require a lower load. We've talked about this before, our experimentation with high frequency training, and there's data to back this up. There's a study from Gomez, 2018, intermediate lifters, same total volume, same exercises. One group did a 5-day kind of bro-ish split. One group split it all up, and you saw the soreness ratings way higher in the group that did a one day per week per body part, and the group that did like 5-day full body-ish, almost no soreness, same gains. So for hypertrophy, you can manipulate the fatigue while maintaining the stimulus, which is interesting, which may allow you to recover more if you need to do more. But with performance adaptations, it kind of always has to feel to some degree hard, and you might have to manipulate that over time with periodization as you get more advanced. But the basic answer is as hard as you need to make progress.
So I'm trying to understand your answer here. So could you say that second part that you said again? So you said you need to train as hard as you need to. And then you said you need to train with, I forget if you said maximum intensity with a specific volume restriction. Is that what you said?
Well, it's more that's how we express fitness, And so the base, like if you think about it at the very basic level, if we go to like exercise physiology, one-on-one, if you want to get better at something, you do that. And you do it at a hard enough intensity that it'll force an adaptation. So like if right now you can run a 10-minute mile, I'm going to say that for myself. Right now I can probably run a 10-minute mile. I don't run, right? It would feel deathly to run a 10-minute mile. And within a couple of weeks, my body would be like, what are you in the Air Force again? And I'd be able to run an 8-minute mile. The 10-minute mile and the 8-minute mile would both suck the same. One would take less time. That'd be nice, and I have a little more time in my day. But the feeling would be similar in terms of the like RPE, the actual rating of perceived exertion. Now, there is some threshold for me as Eric the runner of that percentage of my max mile time that will make me better at running a mile. And there's some percentage that won't. Like if I just went out and walked a mile, that wouldn't make me faster. But if I jogged it, it might do something, because right now I don't jog. Similarly, we have data on strength. Like novices make strength gains at less than 60% of 1RM or in and around there, because the heaviest squat they've done is getting up and down from a chair, So for performance, you basically need to figure out kind of what's that adaptation threshold for your current level of adaptation. And then you need to consider, well, if I just push intensity, like I'm trying to express fitness all the time, that takes a lot of other options off the table. I don't want to just do HIIT, like high intensity training, the old school Mike Mentzer approach, where I'm going to go balls out and just crush myself on this one exercise, and then every other exercise I want. And then once I recover fully and feel great, I'll do it again, because it forces you into this narrow corner of training, which is suboptimal from what we know about frequency and volume. So I think it's useful to understand that at a kind of a first principles basis, it is about a sufficient intensity for the task you're trying to get better at. And that intensity is going to be probably the same for you over time from a relative experience, the necessary RPE, but the absolute external work you're doing is going to change. For the person who can run a 4-hour marathon, they're going to have to do something that is externally really impressive to get faster, but they will still experience it as a marathon, quote unquote. Does that make more sense?
Yeah, it does. So let's break that down, and how well does that track to hypertrophy? Like, so what's the takeaway there when it comes to getting jacked? Like, forget strength.
Yeah. Not well. That's the thing. That's, I think, some of the standard principles of kind of like periodization or programming, when you apply them to hypertrophy, they start to fall apart a little bit. Like if you have the assumption that, fatigue accumulates across a mesocycle or in a microcycle, maybe, but that study by Gomez shows that like you can take the same stimulative volume for an intermediate, experience no soreness or a lot of soreness, 5 points out of a 10 scale, or 0 to 1, but you get the same hypertrophy. So I think, of course, you're going to experience some difficulty, but it depends on where you rate that RPE.
Right.
If you rate like a session RPE, it's going to be something, even though you're not rating like soreness. If you rate a per set RPE, this is where I would say one of the few constants in hypertrophy training. If you are not registering an RPE of like 6 or higher most of the time, you're probably not going to be growing very effectively. It has to be reasonably close to failure, or reasonably heavy, which kind of forces you close to failure immediately, and then do a lot of sets to compromise for the fact you're doing low reps. So on a per set basis for hypertrophy, it should probably be challenging for your work sets, somewhere in the range of like a 5 to 10 RPE, depending on what your current goal is. Most of the time we're talking like, 7, 8, 9 kind of thing. So that's the part that stays with hypertrophy, because in the end, we're trying to get mechanotransduction, right? Mechanoreceptors in the muscle need to sense tension for us to start growing from resistance training. So if a high level of tension needs to be achieved relative to what our current tension adaptations are, we have to feel that. It has to feel like a high level of tension. That can be pushing a low load set reasonably close to failure, or that can be putting 80% on the bar and doing, it could be triples if you want. If you really want to do 7x3, go for it.
Right.
But you'd probably rather do like 4x6,
Right.
So I think that's the constant. And then, so per set, you're probably going to need to experience some reasonably rateable RPE. It has to register on the scale, as a certain number of RIR. And then as far as the global experience of difficulty, there's going to need to be sufficient work. So you might rate your session RPEs, depending on how you split it up, at some amount. But I think you've probably seen this when you went to a full body, which is really like no restrictions on which day you train what. The session RPEs across the week drop a little bit, but the stimulus either stays the same or gets better. And that's what retraction research, right? So I think it's more about the individual sets being difficult enough, and then how do you accumulate enough work? Because the kind of the volume aspect of hypertrophy, I don't know how much we like feel that all the time. There's no reason it has to make you out of breath. There's no reason it has to produce soreness. There's no reason that it has to produce like the feeling of burning, like if you didn't use certain rep ranges. So a lot of the sensations that we associate with disrupting homeostasis, because this is a local adaptation rather than systemic, the training has systemic effects, don't get me wrong, but you can manipulate your training by exercise selection, frequency, proximity to failure, load, rep range, such that you can reduce the sensation of fatigue, which we register as how hard, but maintain the stimulus. So it's pretty variable for hypertrophy, unlike performance.
Right. Okay, that's great. I'm going to put a question to you now that we've been debating forever, not me and you, but just in the community. And,
Sure.
There's this idea that you want to be leaving some reps in the tank, speaking for hypertrophy now, so that you can accumulate more volume. But then you have other people saying, well, it actually works the other way. You need to go pretty hard and get close to failure, and it'd be worth it to slash some of those sets off if you're getting fatigued that way. Is there one that you put above the other?
I think it almost necessarily must be somewhere between those two extreme positions. And not just because I'm trying to be like the political guy who's like, the right and the left are both morons. I'm so smart. But it's more because if we think about what the actual adaptation we're trying to get is, it's the overlap of those two positions, right? If we ramp up the per set stimulus, we increase the total amount of recovery we need, and we necessarily either reduce the frequency, the volume, or we have lingering central fatigue on subsequent days because of high levels of muscle damage, which create a feedback loop, not allowing us to tap into some of those high threshold motor units. And we go to the gym and we just can't turn all the shit on. So we have to balance those two things. How do we get an effective stimulus when we train while still allowing us to come back and put in an effective stimulus the next time? So a lot of the times I'm looking to maintain a moderately high stimulus per set, which typically comes with a moderately high total global RPE, not RIR, but like if we were to take, like, let's put it this way, a cable row at a higher or at a lower RIR, closer to failure, is not going to feel as hard as a squat that is further from failure, just because it's a fucking cable row. Pardon my French. So if we were to look at the Borg RPE of different movements, even though one's closer to failure or further, that's probably roughly what's going to create some of that like central fatigue and be related to the fatigue side of it, right? So that's why when I program things like squats, compound free weight movements, and leg training that recruits 60% of the muscles in your body, deadlifts, etc., you're probably going to see me program those compounds closer to like a 6 to 8 RPE most of the time. Then as we get into calf raises, curls, lateral raises, I wouldn't care if someone went to failure regularly, because it just doesn't have that much of a negative effect. So I think that's probably where that sweet spot is. And then you can, of course, overlay that on kind of like a long-term game plan. Like a deload would look different, an intro week would look different. You might have a harder or easier block for whatever reason, whatever your plan is and your goals are. But I think in general, either one of those extreme positions forces you into doing a really low efficiency type of training, a lot of volume at a low RPE. Hey, I can get all this volume. Yes, so what? You're always getting volume. You're walking on planet Earth and you're maintaining size. Like, that's not enough. There is some threshold of load, that whole mechanoreceptor thing, that we do need to hit, either through fatigue or for going heavy enough or close enough to failure, which are kind of all one and the same for hypertrophy. So that's really what it comes down to. And if you go the other way, we go back to the HIIT example, where you can only train every other fortnight because you just did a set of 10 on deadlifts to absolute failure, beyond technical failure. And then you did it for squats, and then you did it for like 10 other movements. So it almost necessarily has to be in the middle. And there's probably a huge continuum of what's equally effective if you do it intelligently. And that's why you can have people on the more intensity side of the spectrum or volume side of the spectrum who are winning titles, because it probably doesn't make enough of a difference to be a limit to the actual practical outcomes within a given range of that continuum.
So basically, I think what you're saying is you could go really low volume, but you've got to compensate by increasing the intensity, or you could go really high volume, but then you got to compensate by really by dropping the intensity back. You'd call that inefficient training. You think that the best option is to go more moderate with volume and more moderate with intensity. Is that right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I think if you're going really high proximity to failure, or really, really close to failure all the time, it necessarily drops your volume probably into levels we think aren't appropriate. And if you are going really, really high in volume, it requires you to drop the loads or RPE or both to the point where we think the sets are probably less effective on a per set basis. Mm-hmm. So moderately low to moderately high volume is what's reasonably is basically the constraints, and then train sufficiently hard and kind of scaling from moderately hard to or moderate to moderately hard essentially for the experience of what it's like.
Right. Okay. Do you have any personal gripe? It doesn't have to be like personal like that, but just in your coaching experience with that higher intensity, lower volume approach. Like, do you think that that's a perfectly viable way to program for hypertrophy, or do you think in some way that's suboptimal to the more moderate approach that you favor?
This is an interesting one that ties into sociology. The sociology of bodybuilding is that the way you get entrance, the way you get your card of I'm a bodybuilder is I work hard. That can be by doing a ton of volume, or that can be by pushing it to the house and having the blood and guts Dorian Yates style video. And there's it's difficult for people who have ingrained it in their minds from the iconic figures they watch and the process of contest prep, which rewards hard work. Pull yourself up by the bootstraps, hard work, self-made man or woman is kind of the at least the training mentality almost every bodybuilder I've ever met. So if you don't give them that to some degree, sometimes the effort put forth, the enjoyment, and kind of the intentionality, which has physiological outcomes. I'm not saying, magic brain stuff happens if you don't give them what they want, but it has echoes in physiology. So I have gripes when it is extreme to the point where I know, okay, well, at least you're getting the placebo effect of feeling like you're working the way you want to, but at the cost of maybe being within that continuum. So I try to find for each person, putting my coach's hat on, that they are in the continuum, which could be like training 2 days per week per muscle group or training full body. I think that's a pretty broad range. It could be maybe doing 10 sets that are at a pretty high proximity to failure, or doing 20 that are more like 6 to 7 to 8 RP most of the time. And whichever one of those satisfies that person's desire and feeling like they're the hero in their own story in the gym, then that's where I'll help them fall, so long as they enjoy it. Now, don't get me wrong, I do get some of the more evidence-based crowd clients who are also bodybuilders who are like, what is going to get me the fastest gains? Mm-hmm. And that's great. Then their mindset aligns with that, and I don't have to work as much against sociology. But I do think there's a pretty broad continuum. Hypertrophy is one of the most forgiving adaptations. We see Olympic lifters, powerlifters, and bodybuilders who look pretty damn jacked. So there's a lot of ways to skin a cat. And by the way, no cats were harmed in the filming of this. But I like to basically align it with what does the client enjoy, and then if it's outside of the realms of what I think is in that continuum, then we have some conversations.
Mm-hmm. So the client who asks, I just want what's going to work best, forget I'm a robot, I don't have any psychology. What do you say to that person? Is it the more moderate volume, moderate rep approach? It is. And then how do you recommend progression from there? So do you think that then it's okay, well, now as you get more advanced, you're going to have to start to push it harder, or is it more of a add weight to the bar when you can, or is it a let's add sets when you can kind of thing? So describe it. You've got that client who wants the optimal approach, and you've landed on this moderate volume, moderate effort, global thing. Now, how do you progress that person to be okay, let's get you as good as humanly possible,
Fantastic question. So let's say we're starting them out with 15 sets per muscle group on average at an average RPE of 7.5, and the rep range is somewhere in the range of 8 to 12 most of the time. And these are an average of a bunch of things. I probably have compounds, lower RPE, lower rep, a few more sets, and then et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But for that person, I would look at, okay, so what are some of the bottlenecks to performance? Does this person get beat up from heavy loads, right? Or do they just not have a great work capacity? Do they see their set performance and their RPE skyrocket set to set to set to set? Or do they have pretty good set to set endurance? Do they have time constraints? Are they, bodybuilder to human, despite what you may have heard? Like, do they have kids in a family and a job that requires 40 hours a week? Can they not go to the gym more often? And then those things are going to help me decide, all right, we're going to push the RPE a little higher. We're going to try to increase per set stress. Or we're going to try to up the sets and kind of keep that RPE the same. Because both should get the job done, unless they are, a special snowflake, which a lot of us actually are, or at least a snowflake that tends towards one or the other direction,
Right. Yeah. Okay. That's a great answer. That makes a lot of sense. I'm trying to get you to commit really hard. Like, I really want you to say, like, yeah, no, at some point you got to push it harder, or no, you should do the volume thing. But I think it's interesting because it is going to be very individual. And I think that speaks to the fact that when we hear people disagree with disagree on this topic, it could be more of a function of personality. And it's like, this is what really works for me, is just going really hard. Whereas you might have more of an analytical type who has that ability to pull back more and honestly assess how hard it is they're working. They might do better with more of an emphasis on the volume or progressive overload style.
That's a great summary.
So,
can I say one thing, Jeff?
Go ahead. Yeah.
And I'm gonna give you some commitment. It's me and you. You can put a ring on it. There will be times once you move from basically late stage novice, early stage intermediate, where you are going to experience no matter how you dice it, a harder phase of training. I've seen it very consistently that to move from kind of that late stage novice, early stage intermediate to get further, you pretty much have to do more. That could be more heavy loads, or that could be more total volume. That could be more RPE, but it's going to be more, and it's going to feel like more because for the last, let's say, 2 years, you've trained at X difficulty. And there's going to be this adaptation phase where you are having to go above and beyond what you were adapted to see more muscle growth. And it might be a couple mesocycles where that level of training feels really hard. And then but then it kind of tapers off and you're going to make progress again. You kind of reinvigorate, restart the engine. I think people sometimes forget that the time scales elongate as you become more and more advanced, because it's an asymptote getting towards that ceiling of genetic capacity of muscle mass that we never really reach, but we're always getting closer and closer to. That's why you'll see most coaches talk about expectations of muscle gain decreasing over time, or the way we might define some as novice, intermediate, or advanced, like I do in my books, is the rate of progress they can see on the bar at a given rep range or whatever. So not only are we looking to increase the stimulus, but once you adapt it to it, it's not like, oh, and I got to do it again, because you just can't expect to grow that fast. The rate of muscle gain is capped, and we see this from muscle damage, right? It's the same process. Muscle protein synthesis goes up to both remodel and repair tissue, but you can only heal so fast. It's not like if you eat more protein and rest, you can recover from a knife wound in 3 hours. And it's the same thing with growing muscle. You can reduce the fatigue, you can do a great stimulus, you can organize everything perfectly, but there will be a rate limit at how quickly you can grow muscle, and it's going to take more time to see a reasonable amount of progress. So if you try to increase the stimulus past the rate that's reasonable for your rate of your advancement, that's going to be inefficient, and it's going to create problems and new bottlenecks, because now you're going to be like, oh, I got to recover from that and then go back to building muscle. So not only do you have to think about how hard is it, you have to think about how hard is it for how long for me to reasonably gauge, has this person progressed? And that's where the subjectivity of coaching and self-analysis comes in. Like, well, how much could I expect to put on my bench in a year when I'm already at 315 at 180 pounds? It might not be 50 pounds anymore. So what can I expect mesocycle to mesocycle?
Right. I'm curious your take on this criticism against the more moderate approach, that people end up moderating much more than they say they are. So if someone's saying, oh yeah, I'm training at an RPE, you've given this pretty broad range of 5 to 10 as hypertrophy. So you could leave up to, 5 reps in the tank and be okay. Some people would say, well, first of all, that's just way too many. But second of all, people are actually training at an RPE 3 when they say 5, or an RPE 5 when they say 7. What do you say to respond to that?
I would say that's actually, the research would suggest that's pretty common if you talk about non-athletes. And this is one of those places where I've got a blind spot because people see me as like, oh, he's an exercise science researcher, oh, he's a nutrition researcher. I'm not. I'm a bodybuilding and powerlifting researcher. Like if you look at the actual people I've researched, the questions I try to answer, the names of, I try to include those words in most of the titles of the research I do, not on purpose, but so that's not a normal feature of competitive athletes because they have a certain drive to perform. They have something they're trying to reach rather than achieve fitness goals. And there are certainly plenty of people who would fit more into a category of being athletes, even if they don't compete. I imagine a lot of your viewers than the general gym population, you know. And I can't tell someone whether they fit in that mold or not. But I think it's useful to be self-aware, to gauge, all right, when I'm left to my own devices, you know, back when I didn't know as much, right, before I got told that RPE was a thing, what was my default way of training? How did I know when I had a good session? So I'll state my bias here. There was a point before I even had my bachelor's degree, the first couple of years I trained, where I only knew how to train with a workout partner because I needed to get 3 forced reps on each set. You know, my chest day was 3 to 4 sets of bench, incline, decline, and flies, and maybe dips, because that's another exercise you can do for chest. And I would get 2 to 3 spotted reps in the 8 to 12 rep range or 6 to 8 rep range, and I just alternate between them twice a week. And the level of soreness and the performance drops off, and everything that I look at now and go like, what are you doing, was the norm. So I know my default, and that is, you know, squat and do Olympic lifting at the same time until you need hip surgery. So I often I presuppose that on other people. You know, I think that's a natural thing to do, but I am very aware, and thanks to my PhD, of where you start looking at all of these studies of just quote unquote trained people and how close are they to failure. And they almost always undershoot, which is not what we see on Instagram, where people are like grindy, 7, you know. But in the research, you know, we see a relationship between the less training experience someone has, the more they undershoot their RPEs. You know, and really well-trained people who've been at it for 5 years, are probably closer to like athletes than they are kind of the people who've been in the gym 6 months or a year and are just kind of doing it, you know.
Right. Do you think that discredits RPE as a viable tool for, say, like your average gym goer? Like, do you think for them it is better advice for them to just like push that, like say, like, you know, we've got your continuum, to put the average gym goer closer to that more intensity but less volume end of the spectrum? Whereas then when you're more advanced, you could maybe start to moderate that a little bit better as you get more familiar with what failure actually feels like and what RPE 8 feels like and so on and so forth.
100%.
Yeah.
And I think it ends up being more of a logistical and pragmatic benefit as well. The average person who wants to see their body change, they're interested in what is the biggest bang for the buck I can get? What's the least amount of time I can invest to get the most change in my body? If you talk to almost everyone on the street. And when you start, a lot of people don't have intrinsic motivation. They have motivation that is related to, I want to look more attractive for the opposite sex or the same sex, if that's your jam. Or they want to look a certain way. It is about something social and external. And it might become intrinsic, hopefully, you know, fingers crossed, that's kind of my whole jam. But at the start, unless you're just really like you've been bitten by the quote unquote iron bug, you know, the training session of the day is not your favorite part of the day. It's something you're doing. It's just kind of cool. I like it. I'm logging and I'm learning to fall in love with this thing. But initially, like if someone told you, hey, you could train 2 hours per week and get 80% of the gains of training 10 hours per week, and I don't even think that's that's not a mischaracterization. You know, like if you look at the classic Schoenfeld meta-analysis, you see 60% of the hypertrophy gains from doing 1 to 5 sets to failure. And if you go all the way up to 10 plus, you cap out at 100%. But 2/3 of the gains for, in some cases, 1/10 of the volume. It's nuts, you know? Mm-hmm. So for example, one of my in-laws asked me like, hey, I want to see some progress. I want to change my body composition. And I told her, you know what, go to the gym twice per week with at least 2 days off between. And I want you to do 1 set to failure on these 6 machines in a circuit. Mm-hmm. And because she had no interest in training, didn't like it, and was like, you know, what's the one weird trick? And I'm like, well, I can give you 6 weird tricks if you fall between a 6 to 15 rep set and it's a 10 RPE, and you just got to do it once again a week. And I'm pretty confident you're going to see like 3/4 to 80% of the maximal gains you could get if I gave you the quote unquote optimal program, at least at this stage, which is total novice. Mm-hmm. So I 100% agree. that I think intensity, as far as proximity to failure, is absolutely the way to go for someone who is untrained, just getting into it, for both logistical reasons and because they're more likely to undershoot their RP, like you said.
Right, right. Yeah, that's great. Does that kind of make the case, though, that intensity is the more fundamental variable? Because you can, like you just said, drop volume quite low and still get results as long as intensity is there. But you can't do well, maybe you think you can do the opposite. I don't think you can do the opposite. Like, you can't jack volume all the way up to 30 sets a week and have no intensity and still get results. So it's almost like the intensity has to be there as a first principle.
Absolutely. Volume specifically measures the amount of intensity, not the scalar quality, but the dosage, So like, no one would say that volume of any muscular work grows. Because again, is this growing my my medial delt? No, right? It is true, but it's volume of what? Right? They can't exist so separately. So if you take an astronaut off the planet, the guy shrinks till he has just enough muscle mass to move in zero gravity. Put him back on the planet, he's going to have a rough time at first, or she, and then we're going to see muscle mass return to what it needs to be locomotive to their level of activity in a gravity well, right? You put us on a planet with 2 times gravity, we'd look like little hulks, We'd all look like Jeff Nippard. We'd be shorter, thicker, strong. It'd be great. I hate that I'm 6 foot. I need to be on Jupiter. So I think you get what I'm saying, is that, like, it can't be volume, because if it was just volume, being on the planet, we'd all eventually become kind of like this Akira monster, right? So it must be some threshold of mechanotransduction. So it is intensity, believe it or not, if we define it by like motor unit recruitment and attention threshold. But how much of it do you need? And I think we have seen that the problem is when people take that, they understand that first principle, and then they run with it. Like, I've watched videos of Dorian Yates, like his old Blood and Guts videos, and he's interviewed and he's asked, well, what do you do when you stall? And he goes, well, you got to find a way to increase intensity. So I've got to do forced reps. I've got to do pre-exhaust. Okay, well, I've got to, get spotted. I got to do eccentrics, and next thing you know, he shows up to an Olympia with like 14 torn muscles, and I'm not knocking the guy, but the point is if you have a philosophy where certain things are off the table, I can't do another set, I can't reduce the intensity, I can't not go to failure. That's completely contrary to my philosophy, and if we're honest, my work ethic and the way I see myself and the whole iconic view of the high intensity lifter. I can't lose my identity if we really want to get psychological with it. So the only option on the table is find some way to increase the intensity. And don't get it wrong, that works. But do you want to do that? Do you want to deal with the consequences of finding some way to do an eccentric with like a 415 incline bench, while you're dieting, and you need a spotter who you better trust? No thanks. I'd rather just drop the load 40 pounds and do 2 more sets. So yeah.
Yeah. Okay. That makes perfect sense. Intensity is fundamental, assuming constant gravity.
There you go. Exactly. Physics problem, like everything eventually. Yeah.
Okay, I want you to speak about failure specifically. What is the research saying now about the difference between an RPE of 7 or 8 and an RPE of 10 when it comes to hypertrophy? And again, let's assume we're a robot, so ignore psychological factors and let's ignore the safety factors. Let's assume we're using some kind of piece of equipment that we can safely go to failure on repeatedly. What's the difference there? Like, is it even worth it to go to failure at all? How much better is it, or how much worse is it?
This is a great question, and that's the way we should look at our athletes. I'm going to assume you're a robot without feelings, and safety is not a concern. So, no, but in all seriousness, the research doesn't say a whole lot about this. So there's some pretty cool research that's come out of Spain, where they use velocity as a way of kind of saying, yes, this is how far you are from failure, because of the acknowledged limitations that we talked about of someone not knowing how far from failure they really are until they're really quite experienced. And we have a lot of data where you take the same volume load, but one group stops at like a 5 RIR and the other group goes to failure. And we know that compared to which is basically a 5 RPE versus a 10 RPE, it adds a couple, like 24 to 48 hours on the recovery time before you can produce force at the same level again, or at least compared to the other group, I should say. So we have that. So we know that there is some known relationship with the higher the RPE, the closer to failure, and the longer the recovery time before you're probably back at either max full year motor unit recruitment or sufficient at lower enough muscle damage to produce force again. And those are kind of tied, which is interesting. The more we're learning about fatigue, if you look at like a high volume of eccentric contractions, you see a high level of muscle damage, unsurprisingly, but then you also see some central fatigue that can last a couple days, So we can train in the presence of muscle damage. You can train when you're sore. I wouldn't advise like when you're totally sore going balls to the wall, because some of that soreness is not related to necessarily the muscle itself. It could be some of the connective tissue, the ECM, extracellular matrix. But you don't want to train when you're under the presence of central fatigue, because now whole motor units and a ton of fibers are just not getting turned on. So it's almost impossible to put out an effective stimulus. So there must be some point where a really, really high RPE failure-based training becomes counterproductive. And I think we haven't really examined that yet. We've kind of got like far from failure and close to failure. And we've got some research that's like at failure or actually missing a rep. That's one of the definitions of failure versus volitional failure. And God, that's like comparing like an 11 RPE to 10 RPE or a 10 RPE to 5 RPE. So what you're actually asking, we have really limited data on. It's quite, it's an area we need to research. But I think the way we can look at the output of this is by looking at the frequency research. We've got a lot of data on the frequency research. So if the ostensible problem, the assumed problem with going too close to failure is that recovery lag, right? That means that, okay, if we reduce the volume of training to failure, because almost all research is to failure, as a reminder, that might give us some advantage because we can train with a higher frequency and reduce that time lag of that central fatigue, which inhibits hypertrophy. And what do we see? Well, we see pretty reliable that training like around 2 times per week per muscle group, if you're going to failure or more, is slightly better than just training with a traditional 1 times per week approach. So that's kind of the indirect way I can answer that question. My hypothesis would be, based on the limited data, that you start to see disproportionate levels of fatigue and muscle damage that can impede a optimally set up program when you start taking a lot of sets to failure versus, say, stopping at an 8 or even a 9 or a 7 RPE. I do think it's not linear. I think you do start to see kind of this upward curve of that line as far as the fatigue versus RIR versus stimulus. So yeah, and that's reflected in some of the research. I'm thinking of like Izquierdo back in the day showed that there were a poorer testosterone cortisol ratio in a group doing similar volume to failure versus stopping short. But we don't have good quantifications of what stopping short means, quote unquote. So it's a tough one.
I guess given that you don't see these massive differences in the research, it kind of does defeat the idea that failure's got to be the thing. Like you even hear these like overly simplistic like statements like the muscle only knows failure or whatever. Like people really do think that way. Like unless you fail, the muscle won't grow. Now that's definitely not true. But on the other side, you could say, well, until that research comes out, isn't it better to just play it safe and like at least take a couple sets to failure? I mean, it could matter. It really could matter for something, and you could be leaving gains on the table by leaving too many reps in the tank. Given that the fatigue on certain exercises is probably not that significant, it's probably a good idea to make sure you take some sets to failure, and at least then that way you'll have some benchmark by which to compare your RPE 7 and 8 work, so you can be more confident that you're actually hitting a 7 or an 8 and not a 4 or a 5.
Jeff, I think you displayed the thing that I think is the way we need to start thinking about training is we have to think about maximizing the pros and minimizing the potential cons. You kind of gambled there. You're like, well, look, I don't know if this data is true, but I know that if I go to failure, I've at least reached that threshold right now for getting sufficient stimulus. Those mechanotransductors are like, hey, mechanoreceptor, going, hey, yes, I'm going to create the cascade. I'm going to jump up protein synthesis. The protein you eat today will go towards your holy muscle. But if I stop at a 7, am I really at a 7, or am I actually at a 5? And is that enough? I don't know, you know. So that is absolutely a true concern. We don't know. There is some subjectivity there. I think we have to consider the downside, though, is all right, well, I also know that failure does seem to provide more fatigue than the same amount of volume short of failure, right? And don't get me wrong, even though we don't have like specific RIR comparisons to failure, we do have data and in trained lifters showing that stopping short of failure sometimes does produce better hypertrophy or equivalent. And then we have some stuff on less trained lifters showing my failure is a little better, which might come back to some of the things we talked about. So it's a gamble both ways. The problem, like you said, is that we don't know really what our RIR is, especially at these early stages. So what do you do with that? And I think the way you framed it is ideal, is that you probably do want to take some sets to failure. And then we think, okay, well, if that is true, what are the safest sets from that kind of gambling perspective, again, of taking to failure? Well, how about muscles that I don't train the long muscle length that aren't compound movements that are going to generate a lot of fatigue? So if you want to do a lateral raise, or let's say like a cable row, or you want to do leg extensions, some leg curls, calf raises, a lot of those single joint machine movements, absolutely. If you said, hey, I want to do full range of motion, leg press, squats, RDLs, deadlifts, bent over rows to failure, I'd say that's not the gamble I would make. So I 100% agree with you, and it comes down to where do you make those decisions.
Awesome. At the beginning, you spoke about per session hardness, or RPE, or whatever. So you could break it up. And I feel like a lot of this conversation has focused on, not our conversation, but just broadly, has focused on individual sets. But I think that's an interesting point as well, is how hard does the session as a whole actually feel, and what are the downstream consequences of pushing that too hard or not pushing that hard enough. And that's kind of a separate conversation. I'm curious what you think, because a lot of people, because we take this more myopic approach, which is really focused on the individual sets, a lot of people have come to think that, well, going all out on individual sets is the harder way to train. I would think that it's actually harder to do a very high volume session at an RPE of 7 or 8 than to just go in and go all out on 2 or 3 sets for a body part. Like, it's actually not that hard on a global, like, per workout scale to take a few sets to failure. I mean, it depends on the exercise, but some of the high volume, more moderate effort workouts are actually harder to me on a per session basis. So I'm just curious, like, what are your thoughts around that?
Yeah,
difference?
and this goes back to what I said earlier, where the basically what we're talking about is session RPE, and there is some data on session RPE with lifting, and it doesn't necessarily, sometimes it'll scale with intensity and sometimes it'll scale with volume. And there's recommendations to count it as the number of reps, the total number of sets, or the total time. And there are weaknesses to each one of those, because we can't say each set is equivalent. We've talked about that. We can't count all the reps, because you can do low loads, and like a lot of those reps are doing nothing. Same thing as driving up your total tonnage. That doesn't mean anything though, right? So we don't really know how to count session RPE for resistance training. The way I like to do it is to get a number 15 minutes after training's over and multiply it. Just how hard is that session? That's the extent to the question, and then multiply by the number of working sets. That seems to give some metric that goes along with the relative, I wouldn't say the stimulus necessarily. At least for a performance adaptation, I will say it probably be the stimulus, because again, the fatigue and the stimulus are the same thing, to some degree, when you're talking about performance. But for hypertrophy, you can game the system to some degree. You could take a 3-day, again, if we say no time constraints, right? We could take the volume set up on 3 days, and we could spread it across over 5 days, and the session RPEs would go down. And if we actually plotted that metric, we would see the average session RPE for that microcycle would be lower. But you train 5 days per week. So now you'd have to go, okay, well, what's the microcycle RPE? And how do we track that? So it has to come out somewhere. But you absolutely, for hypertrophy, you can manipulate volume, load, frequency, and RPE in such a way that you could reduce the session RPE while maintaining or even increasing the stimulus, which is quite interesting. And it forces you to have to reevaluate some of the principles of periodization when you apply them to hypertrophy. And I think this is where some of those things we think we know about hypertrophy training kind of fall apart a little bit, and why maybe overcomplicating it or creating, well, you must do this, that's where I tend to raise my hand and I go, I don't know about that. Like, does fatigue necessarily accumulate microcycle to microcycle in a hypertrophy program? What if you only train 3 days per week? Is 48 hours not enough time to dump all the different types of fatigue we know after that third session? Like, maybe not when you're advanced and you're trying to cram all your volume and intensity into 3 sessions, but maybe you don't actually need deloads if you set it up a certain way, if you were a robot and you were a novice.
So I got to make sure I got this right. So for the way you're doing it right now for per session RPE is you rank how hard it felt 15 minutes after the session on a scale of 0 to 10.
Yep.
And multiply that by the number of sets for the whole workout. So let's say it was a full body workout and you did, 15 sets, and you ranked it at a 10. It was super hard. That would be a per session RPE of 150.
Correct.
Okay.
You'd have 150 arbitrary units of difficulty. So that's your internal load.
Right.
Yeah.
And then, so then I'm trying to wrap my head around. Okay, so the subjective factor captures the effort component. And then the number of sets is also relevant because we know that doing a lot of sets is actually pretty hard. So that makes sense. What would be the goal there? Like, in tracking that, do you want a high number, a low number, a number just high enough for the adaptation? Like, that's an interesting area to me because I've never really thought about it that way before.
Yeah. So the whole session RPE utility is more about retrospective analysis of blocks, right? And then making sure from a coaching perspective that what you think you're planning, because you're planning the external load, and the client is telling you, here's my internal load, that they match up. So I'll give you a really practical example. So currently I'm training for an Olympic lifting season. I've got 2 comps planned this year, and I'm still a meathead. And I told my coach, like, look, if you give me a few days where you're comfortable with me doing like 3 bodybuilding exercises afterwards, you just put them in there. So essentially on Tuesday, when I've got Wednesday off for my Thursday session, and Thursday, before I've got Friday off for my Saturday session, I've got up to 3 bodybuilding exercises, and he gives me kind of a limit on the day, like this should be medium loading, etc. So he has some idea of the session RPE he's expecting. So if this day at medium loading should be no higher than an 8, let's say that, and I give him a 9, he's going to be like, hey, what's going on? And I might go, I didn't sleep very well. Or, yeah, I did my 3 bodybuilding exercises, but I chose leg press, chin-ups, and weighted dips, and I took every set to failure. And he's going to go, don't do that, So it's basically a tool where you can see when do my manipulations of external load not match my manipulations of internal load. So if you have a periodization program, let's say this is a strength peaking block for a power lifter, and you've got session RPEs that are going to be moderate, but volumes that are going to be very high, total number of sets in a volume block, you're expecting this kind of experience internally. And then as you taper, you should see maybe the session RPEs going up or staying the same, depending on how they experience things. But the total internal load, the multiplicative factor, will be going down because there's less sets. Now, if the session RPE kind of does this, but the volume load doesn't match that, or vice versa, that's when you know that your programming strategy, your periodization strategy, what you're intending for the person to experience is not matching up with what they're experiencing. And that's when with an athlete you can get under the hood. And we don't have a ton of research on session RPE in lifters, but we've got it across a ton of different team sport athletes, endurance athletes, and we see that it is probably one of the better predictors of injury occurrence, adaptation, and it is a good proxy for the stimulus and the fatigue and the recovery status. It's quite useful in that way. It is some of the ways that people have postulated we could model fitness and fatigue, the whole Bannister fitness 2-factor model idea. It's important to remember, though, that we can't model it prospectively, it is retrospective. So you kind of evaluate, what did I do this last mesocycle? All right, go back to the drawing board. This day 3 is supposed to be easy. They're experiencing it hard consistently. We need to fix something about that. Maybe it's what they're doing outside of the gym. That day is stressful for them, the time of day they train, or I'm not anticipating how hard this exercise is for them, for example.
Mm-hmm. That's awesome. That's super interesting. I'll look forward to hearing more about that because that's something I haven't really applied to my own training too much, but it's an interesting way to quantify this question of, what are the downstream consequences of having your per session intensity or your per session effort or RPE or whatever be too high. And it also would be relevant in terms of planning acute variables for a session, because you can individualize how hard someone actually finds something. Because for me, I think I would find fewer sets but taken closer to failure actually easier in some perspective, but some people might be different. So that's a way you can actually subjectively quantify that to the individual. So that's super cool. I like that concept.
Absolutely. The last thing I would say is that for anyone who's interested in this, if they hear this and they're like, oh, I want to use session RPE, it's pretty much useless if you don't have an intention for the block. Like if you just track it, it's like, oh, Thursday was hard. Cool, But if you know that Thursday is supposed to be easy, now it's useful.
Yes.
If you know the average, and also if you want to compare mesocycle averages of session RPE, you need to maintain your frequency. That's another important factor. So if part of your manipulation is that you go from 3 sessions per week, 4 sessions per week, 5 sessions per week to increase volume. I think that's how Brad Schoenfeld does it in his max muscle plan, for example. I don't know if he still uses that, but that's just one example of a very valid way of increasing the stimulus. But your average session RP, it's going to be divided by 3, divided by 4, divided by 5. It might go down, even though your total workload is going up, and that wouldn't be valid. So you have to make sure that you're keeping the frequency static, or looking at something besides an average. You could look at the total session RPEs added together if you wanted, for example.
There's another application, assuming it's validated as a quantifiable as a tool. It could help settle the question of who is more hardcore, the volume people or the intensity people, because you could get a pool of 100 people, get them all to rank their per session RPEs, and give one a high volume program, give the other a low volume, high intensity program, and we can figure out what's more hardcore.
This is the research we need.
Yeah.
who is actually more hardcore? The people doing 4-hour workouts, or the people who are taking each set 4 reps past failure?
It's got to be the 4-hour workout people, right?
Mathematically, you think?
Yeah. Awesome, man. All right, that's all that I got for you, Eric. That was fantastic. I think people are going to get a lot out of this. A lot of cool new stuff there. That's really exciting, man.
Sick, dude.
That was great.